Think about what it took to build Dubai. Not the money, the idea. The audacious, almost delusional belief that you could take a strip of desert, sitting 38 miles from one of the most volatile borders on Earth, and convince the world it was the safest place to put your money, your family, and your future. For 3 decades, it worked. More than that, it became one of the most successful nation-branding operations in modern history. Nearly 20 million international visitors in 2024. A property market that crossed $147 billion in transactions. Hotel rooms that sold out at $620 a night during peak season. The world's busiest international airport, moving 95 million passengers a year through a single hub. The dream was not just credible, it was, by almost every measurable metric, real. And then, on February 28th, 2026, at approximately 2 in the morning, Gulf Standard Time, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under an operation the Pentagon named Epic Fury. Within 72 hours, the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, was effectively closed. And the question that nobody in a Dubai boardroom or a Dubai tourism office had ever been willing to answer out loud suddenly became the only question that mattered. What happens to a city that sold the world certainty when certainty runs out? Dubai was never just a city, it was a product. A very precisely engineered product with a very specific value proposition. The pitch was this: come here and the chaos of the world does not apply to you. Conflicts in Europe, political instability in Asia, high inflation crises in the West. None of it touches you inside the bubble. The infrastructure works. The legal system, at least for business, is predictable. The tax rate is zero. The sun is always on schedule. And if you ever need to be somewhere else in the world within 8 hours, the airport is 15 minutes away. That was the product. Not the Burj Khalifa, not the Palm, not the brunch. Certainty, stability, predictability. Dubai was, to borrow the exact phrase used by Bob McNally, who advised the George W. Bush administration on oil and energy and now consults on global markets, something very close to a bedrock assumption. The assumption that the Gulf works, that the oil flows, that the planes land and depart, that the money is safe. McNally said it to CBS News when the strait first closed. He said that if Hormuz shuts for a month, one of the most important bedrock assumptions in how the global economy works will have collapsed. He was talking about oil. But he could just as easily have been talking about Dubai, because Dubai was a financial product built entirely on top of that assumption. Now let's look at what actually happened, because the numbers from the first 5 weeks after February 28th, 2026, are not numbers you see in peacetime. They are not correction numbers. They are not adjustment numbers. Dubai International Airport, which had handled 95.2 million passengers in 2025, suspended operations completely on March 1st. In a single day, more than 3,400 flights were canceled across Dubai, Al Maktoum, Abu Dhabi, and Sharjah. Between February 28th and March 8th, a combined 37,000 scheduled routes touching the Gulf were disrupted. Emirates, the flagship carrier and one of the structural pillars of the entire Dubai economy, temporarily suspended operations and then restarted at roughly 60% of its normal network capacity. Hotel occupancy across the city dropped to between 15 and 20%, according to Maymoon Meeden, chief business officer at Wago, one of the region's largest online travel platforms. In a city where hotels had been running near full capacity through the winter season, that number is not a slowdown. It is near complete stoppage. The World Travel and Tourism Council estimated the Gulf region was losing $600 million in visitor spending every single day the conflict continued. Hotel bookings had collapsed more than 60% within 48 hours of the escalation. Five-star properties on the Palm Jumeirah, which were selling suites at historic highs just weeks earlier, were offering emergency flash discounts of 20 to 40% just to retain occupancy above critical threshold. More than $120 billion was wiped from market capitalization on the Dubai and Abu Dhabi stock exchanges in the first month. The Dubai Financial Market Index dropped 16% since the war began, more than double the decline in Abu Dhabi. Goldman Sachs analysts estimated real estate transactions had dropped 37% year on year, with property sales plunging more than 50% compared to February 2026. Some properties were reportedly being sold at discounts of 10 to 15% by owners seeking a rapid exit. Shares in Emaar Properties, the developer behind the Burj Khalifa, fell more than 25%. These are not projections. These happened. And here's where the story becomes more important than the headline. Because none of this started on February 28th. That date did not create Dubai's vulnerability. It exposed it. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is the width of the English Channel at Dover. And for 3 decades, Dubai built its entire civilizational model on the assumption that nothing would ever happen to those 21 miles. Not because that assumption was unreasonable, it wasn't. The United States Navy had maintained freedom of navigation in the Gulf since the 1980s, but it was still an assumption. It was always a single point of failure built into every investment thesis, every expansion plan, every billion-dollar hotel pipeline, every golden visa application. And what February 28th did was not introduce a new risk. It activated a risk that had always been priced at zero. When Iran's Revolutionary Guard officially confirmed the strait was closed on March 2nd and warned any vessel attempting transit would be targeted, vessel tracking data showed tankers stalling completely, with roughly 500 ships anchored in open Gulf waters. War risk insurance for ships attempting passage was canceled for the March 5th window, making the economic cost of passage prohibitive regardless of the military risk. The International Energy Agency took the unprecedented step of announcing it would release 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserve. And by March 19th, Dubai crude oil prices had reached $166 per barrel, their highest level ever recorded. Now here is what the disruption looked like on the ground, and it did not look the same for everyone. For the ultra-wealthy, the first instinct was evacuation, not panic. Wealthy expatriates reportedly paid up to $250,000 for private charter evacuation flights in the first days after the airport closures. That is a significant sum of money. It is also a sum of money that the people paying it could afford. For this group, Dubai's value proposition was always optional: an address, a lifestyle, a tax optimization. When the address became uncomfortable, they activated the contingency plans that their wealth had always given them: the private jets, the second passports, the capital already distributed across Singapore, Lisbon, and Zurich. Dubai's 237 centimillionaires and 20-plus billionaires did not lose everything. They reoriented. For the mid-level professional class, the expat managers, the financial analysts, the hospitality executives, the architects and engineers who had built their lives in Dubai over years of steady accumulation, the calculus was completely different. These are people who came for the promise of building real wealth in a zero-tax environment with a high quality of life. Many of them had property. Many of them had children in schools. Many of them had careers dependent on industries, tourism, aviation, real estate, finance that were taking direct hits. According to Citi, the war introduced considerable risk to Dubai's future population growth, with projections now revised to just 1% growth in 2026, well below the recent trend of 4% annually. These people are not evacuating on private jets. They are recalculating, and then there are the workers that nobody is writing the analysis reports about, i.e. the taxi driver, the construction laborer, the kitchen staff at the Palm Jumeirah resort that slashed its rates and cut its headcount in the same week. Over 220,000 Indian nationals were repatriated from the Gulf Cooperation Council region in the first weeks of the conflict, and this is the figure that economists in New Delhi are studying most carefully. Because unlike the temporary labor migrations of previous disruptions, analysts note that this reverse migration involves a high percentage of skilled professionals and business owners, people who are not coming back at the first sign of a ceasefire. People who experience the vulnerability of building a life on temporary residency in a city that, when the pressure came, could not guarantee their safety, their income, or their future. And this is where the analysis has to go deeper than the conflict itself. Because the Strait of Hormuz crisis accelerated and exposed something that was already there. Dubai's economic model has a structural design flaw that its promoters understood and chose never to publicly interrogate. The flaw is this: every pillar of the Dubai economy, tourism, aviation, real estate, financial services, logistics, is simultaneously dependent on two things that can never be fully controlled. First, the perception of safety in a region where safety is not guaranteed. Second, the continuous flow of transient capital and transient people, neither of which builds lasting civic roots. The Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, working with Oxford Economics, published its first quarter 2026 economic update 3 weeks into the conflict. It is worth reading carefully. It projects that non-energy sectors across the Gulf Cooperation Council will grow by just 0.1% in 2026, compared to a pre-war forecast of 4.2%. It notes that sectors like tourism may take longer to recover than energy, which could weigh on diversification momentum in the near term. That phrase, diversification momentum, is the most important phrase in that report, because Dubai has spent 15 years telling the world that its diversification strategy was complete, that it was no longer dependent on oil, that tourism and finance and logistics had replaced the old model. What the Oxford Economics analysis reveals is that the new model was just as fragile as the old one, only the fragility was concentrated in perception rather than in a commodity price. And the old Dubai could survive a drop in oil prices because it had already pivoted. The new Dubai cannot survive a collapse in confidence because confidence was the commodity it was selling. Tourism Economics, an analysis cited alongside data from the World Travel and Tourism Council, projects that the Middle East could record between 23 and 38 million fewer international visitors in 2026 than previously forecast, representing a reduction of between $34 and $56 billion in visitor spending across the region. Dubai, as the preeminent hub of Gulf travel, is expected to absorb a substantial share of that loss. Natasha Sideris, the founder of the Tasha's Hospitality Group and one of the most prominent voices in Dubai's restaurant and hospitality sector, described the current environment as nothing short of devastating. And she is not an outside critic. She is someone who built a business betting on Dubai's trajectory. When people like her use the word devastating, it is not rhetoric. So where does this leave us? Dubai has demonstrated resilience before. The 2008 financial crisis nearly broke the emirate and required a $10 billion bailout from Abu Dhabi. The pandemic in 2020 produced a population contraction of 8.4%, one of the sharpest in any major global city. Both times Dubai recovered. Both times the numbers eventually came back. And that resilience is real. Ignoring it would be dishonest. But there is a distinction that every serious analysis of this moment has to make, because it is the distinction that determines whether the title of this video is true or not. There is a difference between operational recovery and perception recovery. Dubai International Airport will eventually reopen at full capacity. Emirates will eventually restore its network. Hotels will eventually reprice back to market rate. The operational infrastructure of Dubai is not destroyed. It is disrupted. Operational disruption takes weeks to resolve. Perception damage takes years. The question that investors, residents, and future migrants are now asking is not whether the Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen. It will. The question is whether the mental model of Dubai as the uniquely safe, uniquely stable platform in an unstable region is still coherent. Because that mental model was the product. Not the airport, not the hotels, not the towers. The product was the certainty. And you cannot unknow what the last 5 weeks have shown. You cannot unsee 500 oil tankers anchored in the Gulf, unable to move. You cannot unread the insurance cancellation notices. You cannot unfeel the moment when you looked at your apartment on the Palm and realized that the 11 intercepted ballistic missiles that hit debris near the Burj Al Arab were intercepted, but that the next ones might not be. Citi now expects Dubai's population growth to average around 2% annually through 2031, well below the 4% trend that underpinned a decade of real estate investment theses. That is not a catastrophic decline. But it is the difference between a city that continues to accelerate and a city that begins the slower, harder work of figuring out what it actually is beneath the brand. If you live in Dubai or if you had decided to move there this year, I want to know honestly whether the calculation has changed for you. Not whether you still love the city, whether the math still works. Tell me in the comments because that conversation is one this channel takes seriously. And if the kind of analysis that goes beyond the press release, that reads the actual reports and asks the questions the official statements won't, is what you come here for, you know what to do.